Do you know what it's like to live as a gay person, born into a refined family where everything must be perfect, like a meticulously painted picture on a canvas? Have you ever felt like you're living in a play where every eye is watching, waiting for you to play your role correctly, say the right lines, and never stray from the script? Let me tell you. My name is Julian Pierce, and this is the story of the years I lived in the shadows, where the true light of who I am was hidden beneath layers of a flawless facade. I grew up in a small town called Willow Creek, nestled among the lush green hills of Pennsylvania. The town was so small you could walk from one end to the other in less than an hour, and everyone knew each other as if the whole world was confined to a few streets. My house stood on a tree-lined road shaded by oaks, with a white picket fence and a garden my mother tended to daily. That was where I was born, where I grew up, and where I learned to hide myself. My father, Robert Pierce, was a renowned lawyer in the area. He wasn't just the legal representative for nearly every family in Willow Creek. He was a symbol of success, discipline, and standards. Tall, with a deep, resonant voice, his presence seemed to thicken the air whenever he entered a room. People respected him not only for his talent but for the way he always kept everything under control. My mother, Elizabeth, was a literature teacher at the local high school. She was gentler than my father, but beneath that gentleness was an iron resolve. She believed our family had to be a model for the entire town, flawless, without mistakes. I was the eldest son, followed by my younger brother Nathan, a mischievous but bright kid, and my little sister Sarah, whom my mother doted on like a little princess. From a young age, I knew I was different. Not different in a standout or special way, but a vague feeling, as if I were wearing clothes that didn't fit. I didn't know what to call it. I just knew I wasn't like the other boys in town. They liked baseball, gathering in backyards to brag about climbing trees or catching fish. I was different. I liked sitting alone in my room, scribbling drawings of big cities, brightly lit streets, and people I imagined were free. I loved listening to my mother read Whitman or Dickinson's poetry, letting their words carry me away from this stifling town. But that feeling of being different wasn't allowed to exist. Not in the Pierce family. My father always said, "You're the eldest son, Julian. You have to set an example." Setting an example meant getting good grades, being obedient, never talking back, and most importantly, never doing anything to bring shame to the family. My mother was gentler, but her looks and her words, like, "Julian, you need to try harder to make your father happy," always made me feel like I was wearing a heavy mask. I didn't want to disappoint my parents. I loved them, and I knew they loved me in their own way. But that love came with expectations I wasn't sure I could meet. When I was 10, I vividly remember one summer evening. The family was gathered around the dining table, the warm yellow light illuminating the plates of food my mother had prepared. My father was recounting a case he'd just won, his voice brimming with pride. Nathan and Sarah were laughing and joking while I sat quietly, focusing on my food. Then my father turned to me and asked, "Julian, how was school today? What did your teacher say about your math test?" I hesitated, knowing my math score wasn't as high as expected. I got an 85, sir." Silence. My father's gaze was icy, as if I had committed an unforgivable sin. 85? Do you think 85 is enough to get into a good college? Do you think it's enough to bring honor to this family? I lowered my head, feeling a weight pressing down on my chest. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder but said nothing. She never contradicted my father. Moments like that repeated themselves year after year. I learned to stay silent, to smile even when my heart was cracking. I studied hard, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to see my father's disappointed look. I joined the school basketball team, even though I hated the feeling of sweaty skin and the loud cheers. I did everything to become the son my parents wanted, but deep inside, that sense of being different grew like a shadow creeping into my soul. When I was 15, I began to realize that feeling had a name. I didn't dare say it out loud or think about it for too long, but it was there, as clear as the sunlight streaming through my bedroom window every morning. I liked looking at my classmate Tommy in a way I shouldn't have. Tommy had messy blonde hair, a smile as bright as summer, and the way he ran on the basketball court made my heart beat faster than usual. I was terrified. I lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was a mistake of creation. I prayed, as my mother had taught me, asking God to fix me, to make me normal. But nothing changed. I started hiding myself even more carefully. I avoided looking at Tommy too long, avoided the stories about girlfriends that the boys in class loved to share. I buried myself in books and in secret drawings I hid under my bed. But even those drawings betrayed me. They weren't of pastoral landscapes or Willow Creek houses. They were of people, of boys, of eyes I didn't dare meet in real life. I knew if my parents found them, I would no longer be Julian Pierce, the eldest son of the family. In my final year of high school, the pressure intensified. My father had planned my future. I would study law like him at a prestigious university. "It's the only path, Julian," he said, as if there were no other options. I nodded, but inside I just wanted to run away. I wanted to go somewhere I could be myself, even though I still didn't know who that was. I applied to the University of Pennsylvania as my father wished, and when the acceptance letter arrived, the whole family celebrated. My father clapped me on the shoulder, and for the first time I saw him smile at me like that. "Well done, son. You've made me proud." But I didn't feel proud. I felt like I was stepping into a lavishly decorated prison. The day I left Willow Creek for Philadelphia, my mother hugged me tightly. "Remember, Julian," she whispered, "you are the hope of this family." I nodded, but as the bus rolled away, I looked out the window, watching the hills fade into the distance. And for the first time, I felt a sliver of freedom. I didn't know that freedom would soon turn into a storm, sweeping me away from everything I had ever called home. But that's a story for the years that followed. For now, I was just an 18-year-old boy carrying heavy secrets and a heart full of scars, stepping into a new world. I didn't know that world would both liberate me and destroy me, and then, in a miraculous way, rebuild me from the ground up. The University of Pennsylvania was a completely different world. Ancient moss-covered buildings, cobblestone paths filled with students whose eyes sparkled with dreams, and an atmosphere of freedom so palpable it felt like I could breathe it in. I studied law as my father wanted, but my heart wasn't in the thick tomes on civil or criminal law. It was in the evenings when I sneaked out to the small corners of the city, to little cafes, makeshift art galleries, and people who lived true to themselves. I started drawing again, no longer hiding my sketches under the bed. I drew streets, faces, and dreams I hadn't dared to name. Then I met Luke. He came into my life like a gust of wind, unexpected and irresistible. Luke was a junior, an art major with messy black hair, eyes as blue as an autumn sky, and a smile that made me forget how to breathe. We met in an elective art history class I'd signed up for just to escape the dry hours of law. He sat next to me, his fingers smudged with ink, and asked if I wanted to share a coffee after class. I agreed, though my heart pounded like it might burst. Luke was the first person who made me feel like I didn't have to hide. He told me about his family in Ohio, about coming out as gay at 16, and how his family, though not fully supportive, had accepted him. "Just be yourself, Julian," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The world is big enough for all of us." I looked into Luke's eyes, and for the first time I thought I might be able to do it. Maybe I wasn't a mistake of creation. We started dating, secretly at first, because I was still afraid. Afraid of the gazes of those around me, afraid someone from Willow Creek might see me. But Luke had a way of making me forget my fears. We walked along the Schuylkill River hand in hand when night fell and no one was watching. We sat in small bars where dim lights and jazz music made me feel like I was living in a movie. The first time I kissed Luke under the glow of a street lamp, it felt like the world stopped turning. That was the moment I knew I couldn't go back, couldn't keep living in the shadows. But freedom came at a cost. Every time I called home, my mother's voice was still gentle but distant, as if she sensed the change in me. My father always asked about my grades, about law internships, and I had to lie. I told them everything was fine, that I was still on the path he'd laid out for me. But I knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. I knew one day I would have to face them and myself. In my final year of college at 22, I decided to tell the truth. I was tired of living two lives. One Julian in Philadelphia, free and in love with Luke, and another Julian in Willow Creek, obedient and perfect. I wanted to be one person, even if it meant losing everything. I planned carefully. I would go home after graduation with my law degree in hand, to prove I hadn't let the family down. I would sit down with my parents, tell them I was gay, that I loved Luke, and that I was still their son despite being different. The day I returned to Willow Creek, a light rain was falling. The old house was the same as ever, with its white picket fence and my mother's carefully tended garden. I walked in, my suitcase clattering on the wooden floor. My mother hugged me, but I could feel the tension in her embrace. My father was in the living room reading the newspaper, his gaze as cold as always. Nathan and Sarah were there too, but they were busy with their phones and didn't pay much attention. Dinner passed in silence, with only the sound of silverware clinking against plates. I waited, my heart pounding, my hands trembling so much I had to hide them under the table. After dinner, I took a deep breath and said, "Dad, Mom, I have something to tell you." The air in the room grew heavy. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with worry. My father folded his newspaper slowly, as if he knew what was coming. I told them about Luke, about how I had been living true to myself, about being gay. I tried to keep my voice steady, but every word felt like a knife cutting into my heart. I said I still loved them, that I still wanted to be part of the family, that I hoped they would understand. Silence. A terrifying silence, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then my mother started crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears streaming down her cheeks. My father stood up, his face red, his eyes blazing with anger. "What did you say?" his voice thundered. I repeated, my voice trembling. "I'm gay, Dad. I just want to live true to myself." He stepped closer, so close I could feel his hot breath. "You're not my son," he growled. "You're a disgrace." I stood frozen, as if the blood in my veins had stopped flowing. My mother covered her face, saying nothing. Nathan and Sarah looked at me, their eyes full of confusion and fear. I tried to explain, to say I was still me, still Julian, but my father cut me off. "Get out of my house, now." I looked at my mother, hoping she'd say something, anything, but she only bowed her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I don't remember how I packed my things. I only remember dragging my suitcase out of the house under the increasingly heavy rain. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in my head like a verdict. I stood on the sidewalk, soaked, looking at the lit-up house I had once called home. I called Luke, my voice choked with tears. They kicked me out. Luke told me to take a bus back to Philadelphia immediately, that he'd be waiting for me. After that confrontation with my parents, I fell into depression. I started questioning whether I was wrong to tell the truth, whether I deserved to be treated like this. I missed my parents, missed Nathan and Sarah, missed the evenings when our family sat around the dinner table. I wrote a 3-page letter to my mother telling her about my life, about Luke, about how I still loved her. I sent it but never got a reply. I called home but no one picked up. I felt like I was dead to my family. But Luke didn't let me sink too deep. He pulled me out of the darkness little by little. "I know you're hurting, Julian," he said, holding my hand, "but you can't let them define who you are." Luke helped me find a stable job as an assistant at a small design studio in Philadelphia. I started drawing again, not to hide, but to heal. Each brushstroke was a way to reclaim myself. Still, the pain lingered. Every time I saw a family pass by, laughing and talking happily, it felt like someone was squeezing my heart. I missed Willow Creek, my mother's garden, my father's warm voice when he wasn't angry. I knew I couldn't go back, but I couldn't stop hoping. Hoping that one day they would understand. hoping that I could still be their son. I began to feel that Philadelphia was no longer a place I could stay. Every street corner, every cafe reminded me of the days I secretly loved Luke, of the unanswered calls, and of the door in Willow Creek slamming shut behind me. Luke sensed the suffocation within me. One winter evening, as we huddled in our small apartment, Luke took my hand and said, "Julian, let's get out of here. A fresh start, just you and me." I looked into his eyes, those blue eyes still shining as brightly as the day we met, and I nodded. We decided to move to Chicago, a big, unfamiliar city where I hoped I could rediscover myself. Chicago greeted us with biting winds from Lake Michigan, but also with a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. We rented a small apartment in Wicker Park with peeling walls and creaky windows that rattled with every gust of wind. The apartment wasn't anything special, but it was where Luke and I began to build a life together. Luke found a job at a small art gallery, while I continued working as an assistant for a graphic design company. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to get us through the first few months. I started teaching myself more about design, learning software, and figuring out how to turn the ideas in my head into reality on a computer screen. Every night I sat at our tiny kitchen table, drawing and editing late into the night, while Luke brewed coffee and whispered, "You'll make it, Julian. You were born for this." Those early years in Chicago weren't easy. There were months when we ate instant noodles for a week straight because rent took up most of our income. There were nights I stayed awake wondering if I was on the right path. But Luke was always there with his smile and warm embrace, reminding me that we were building something meaningful. Gradually, I started getting bigger projects. A Kessel advertising agency in the Loop hired me as a freelancer for a campaign, and my design was chosen as the centerpiece. That was the first time I felt truly valuable, not because I was the eldest son of the Pierce family, but because I was Julian, someone who had risen from the ashes on his own. After 4 years, I was hired by a major advertising agency in Chicago as a creative director. I was no longer the trembling boy standing in the rain in Willow Creek. I wore suits, attended meetings with big clients, and had a small office overlooking the Chicago River. But success didn't fill the void inside me. Every Thanksgiving or Christmas, I felt like an outsider. Luke and I hosted small parties with friends, but when everyone went back to their families, I could only sit by the window watching the snow fall, thinking about my mother, Nathan, and Sarah. I wondered what they were doing, whether they ever mentioned me or if I had been completely erased from their memories. I still wrote letters home, knowing they might be thrown away the moment my mother saw the envelope. Every year on my father's birthday, I sent a postcard with a few short lines. "Happy birthday, Dad. I'm doing okay. Julian." On Father's Day, I sent a bottle of wine I knew he liked, along with a letter about my life in Chicago. I didn't expect a reply, but I couldn't stop sending them. It was the only way I felt connected to Willow Creek, to the family I once called home. Luke became my greatest anchor. We became an official couple, not just in our own eyes, but in the eyes of the law, when Illinois legalized same-sex marriage. Luke proposed to me one summer evening on Navy Pier, with the Ferris wheel lights glowing brightly behind us. "Julian Pierce," he said, kneeling with a simple ring, "will you be my lover, my friend, and my husband?" I burst into tears, not out of sadness, but because for the first time I felt completely and unconditionally loved. I nodded, and we embraced under the city lights, as if the whole world was celebrating with us. But even Luke's love couldn't erase the loneliness inside me. There were nights when I lay beside him listening to his steady breathing, yet still felt empty. I wanted my mother to call, my father to say he was proud, Nathan and Sarah to laugh and joke with me like when we were kids. I wanted to go back to the house in Willow Creek, not to apologize, but to be seen for who I was. But every unanswered letter, every call that went to voicemail was a reminder that I had been disowned. In my 11th year in Chicago, I thought I had grown used to the pain. I was 33 with a solid career, a nicer apartment in Lakeview, and Luke by my side. But then, One October morning, as the golden leaves began to fall, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a distant relative, Aunt Mary, someone I'd only met a few times at family gatherings. Her voice trembled over the phone. "Julian, I'm so sorry. Your father passed away. A stroke. Last night." I stood frozen, the phone slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. Luke rushed over, wrapping his arms around me, but I felt nothing but a cold, hollow void. My father was gone. The man who had been the center of my world, who had kicked me out of the house, who I kept writing to despite never getting a reply, was no longer here. I didn't know what to feel. Grief, anger, or relief. Luke sat with me all night, holding my hand, and said, "You should go back, Julian. Not for them, but for you. To find closure." I didn't want to go. I was afraid to face my mother, Nathan, Sarah, and the eyes that would look at me like a stranger. But Luke was right. I needed to return, not to apologize, but to say goodbye in my own way. I booked a flight to Pennsylvania, my heart heavy. As the plane took off, I looked out the window, watching Chicago's lights fade into the distance, and wondered if Willow Creek would still recognize me, or if I had become a stranger in my own home. The plane landed at Harrisburg Airport on a gloomy morning, the sky gray as if mourning with me. I rented a car and drove to Willow Creek, the familiar road with its green hills now feeling strangely foreign. 11 years is a long time, enough to change a person, but seemingly not enough to change this town. The wooden houses, white picket fences, and the Willow Creek "Where Love Begins" welcome sign were exactly as I remembered them. But I was no longer the 18-year-old boy who left with a suitcase full of hope. I was a 33-year-old man carrying invisible scars and a heart unsure whether to grieve or be angry. The family house still stood on the oak-lined street. The white picket fence was now faded, and my mother's garden no longer meticulously tended. I parked in front of the gate but didn't dare step inside. I was afraid to see my mother, afraid her gaze would be as cold as it was the day she let my father kick me out. I was afraid of Nathan and Sarah, now grown, looking at me like a traitor. But most of all, I was afraid of myself, afraid I wouldn't be strong enough to face it all. The funeral was held at First Presbyterian Church, where my family used to attend every Sunday. I walked in, feeling the weight of every stare. Relatives, neighbors, familiar faces from my childhood now looked at me like an outsider. I heard whispers. "Is that Julian? He actually came back? Only showing up now that his father's dead, probably for the money." I bowed my head, trying to ignore them, but each word cut into my heart like a knife. I wasn't here for money. I came to say goodbye to my father, even though he once said I was no longer his son. I found a secluded spot in the back row of the church, trying to make myself small. The church was unchanged, with its stained glass windows depicting Jesus and angels, light streaming through in colorful streaks across the wooden floor. The smell of old wood and lilies from my father's coffin filled the air. I looked at the coffin, placed in the center, covered in white flowers, and felt my chest tighten. My father lay there, the man who had been a mountain in my life, now just a lifeless body. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, there was an emptiness, as if I had cried myself dry 11 years ago. My mother sat in the front row, her back straight, dressed in simple black. She didn't turn to look at me, though I was certain she knew I was there. Nathan and Sarah sat beside her. Nathan taller than I remembered, and Sarah now a 20-year-old woman with long hair like our mother's. They didn't look at me, not a glance, not a nod. I felt like a ghost, present but invisible. The service began. The pastor read scripture, his voice rising and falling like a mournful song. My father's old friends stood up, sharing stories of how he helped them win cases, of his generosity and strictness. I listened, but it felt like they were talking about a stranger. My father wasn't just a skilled lawyer or a model citizen. He was the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who laughed heartily when I drew him with colored pencils. But he was also the man who shouted in my face, kicked me out of the house, and cut off all contact. I didn't know how to remember him. When the pastor invited people to speak, a jolt ran through me. I hadn't planned to say anything. I just wanted to sit there quietly and leave when it was over. But then I thought of the letters I'd sent, the ones that were never answered. I thought of Luke, of how he said I needed to close this chapter of my past. And I thought of myself, the scared boy in a Willow Creek bedroom and the man I'd become in Chicago. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the pulpit. The church fell silent. I felt my mother's eyes, Nathan's, Sarah's, everyone's. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm Julian Pierce," I began, "the eldest son of Robert Pierce." Whispers rippled through the room, but I didn't stop. My father was a complicated man. He taught me about perseverance, about never giving up. But he also taught me about pain, about being rejected by the people you love. I spoke about my father, not the perfect lawyer everyone praised, but the father in my memories. I talked about the evenings he read the newspaper, the way he laughed when Sarah danced in the living room, the time he taught Nathan how to tie a tie. I mentioned the letters I sent him, knowing he might have thrown them away. And then I told the truth. 11 years ago, my father said I wasn't his son because I'm gay. But today I stand here, not to apologize, but to say that I still love him. I forgive him. And I hope somewhere he forgives me too. Silence. No applause, no sobs. Just my mother's eyes meeting mine for the first time, cold and expressionless. Nathan looked down. Sarah clutched our mother's hand. I stepped down, feeling as if I'd lifted a ton of weight off my shoulders, but also reopened an old wound. I didn't know if I'd done the right or wrong thing, but I knew I needed to say those words. After the service, I stood outside the church watching people leave. A distant relative, Uncle George, patted my shoulder and said, "That was brave, Julian. But don't expect them to accept you easily." I nodded, saying nothing. I didn't expect acceptance. I just wanted to see my father one last time, even if only through the words I'd spoken. That evening, I received a message from my father's lawyer, Henry Thompson. He asked me to come to his office the next morning to read the will. "The whole family will be there," he said. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to face my mother, Nathan, or Sarah. Didn't want to hear more cutting remarks. But Luke, over the phone from Chicago, reminded me, "You're stronger than they think, Julian. Go and face them." I agreed, though my heart felt like lead. When I walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, the air was thick with tension. My mother sat in a corner, still in black, her eyes avoiding mine. Nathan and Sarah sat beside her, silent. I chose a chair as far away as possible, trying to make myself invisible. But I knew whether I wanted it or not, today would change everything. Henry Thompson's office was on the second floor of an old building in downtown Willow Creek, with yellowed walls and the faint smell of aged paper. Mr. Thompson, a man in his 60s with silver hair and round glasses, sat behind a large wooden desk, a thick stack of documents in front of him. He cleared his throat, looked around the room, and began, "Thank you all for being here today. We are gathered to read the will of Mr. Robert Pierce." My mother nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the floor. Nathan sat with his arms crossed, his face tense, while Sarah fidgeted with her necklace, her gaze sliding past me as if I didn't exist. I sat quietly, trying to suppress the growing unease within me. I expected nothing from this will. My father had kicked me out of the house and cut off all contact. I was only here to close a chapter of my life, to say a final goodbye to him, even if just through words on paper. Mr. Thompson began reading, his voice steady like a recitation of scripture. He spoke of my father leaving the house and most of his assets to my mother, a scholarship fund in his name for the local high school, and a small sum for Nathan and Sarah to start their own lives. I listened, unsurprised. It was what I had expected, a fair will, reflecting the impeccable image my father held in the community. I assumed my name wouldn't be mentioned, and I had prepared myself for that. But then Mr. Thompson paused, pushed his glasses up, and looked directly at me. "Before we proceed," he said, "Mr. Robert left a video. He requested that all family members watch it before I reveal the final part of the will. The air in the room grew heavier. My mother lifted her head, her eyes sharpening. Nathan frowned and Sarah whispered something to her. My heart pounded as if it might leap out of my chest. A video? My father, always stoic and practical, wasn't the type to leave emotional messages. I didn't know what to expect. Mr. Thompson opened a laptop and the screen lit up. My father's face appeared, older and more tired than I remembered. He sat in his study, light from the window illuminating his silver hair and the deep wrinkles on his forehead. His voice was frail but carried the authoritative tone I had once feared. "If you're watching this video," he began, "then I'm no longer here." I heard my mother draw a sharp breath and Sarah clutched her hand tightly. I sat motionless, my eyes glued to the screen, not daring to blink. My father coughed lightly, then continued, "I've lived an imperfect life. I tried to be the best husband and father I could, but I know I made mistakes, especially with my eldest son, Julian." My name coming from his lips felt like a punch to the chest. My mother turned to look at me, her eyes filled with shock and anger. Nathan muttered something, but I couldn't make it out. All I could hear was my father's voice, weak but clear, cutting through the 11 years of dust. "Julian," he said, looking directly into the camera as if meeting my eyes, "I was wrong to kick you out of the house. I was wrong not to listen, not to try to understand you. I read every letter you sent, every postcard, every gift. I kept them in my drawer, and each time I read them, I felt regret. I never had the chance to tell you I'm sorry, to hold you one last time." Tears welled up, though I tried to hold them back. I saw my mother bow her head, her shoulders trembling. Sarah sobbed, and Nathan clenched his fists, his face flushed. I didn't dare look at them. I just looked at my father, the man who had been a mountain in my life, now admitting his mistakes before leaving forever. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, "but I want to do the right thing, even if it's too late. Julian, I'm leaving you 50% of my estate as a way to make amends. I hope you'll use it to live the life you deserve." The screen went dark. Silence engulfed the room, heavy like a storm about to break. Then my mother stood abruptly, her voice trembling with anger. "What is this, Henry? Some kind of joke? Robert wouldn't do this. He doesn't deserve it." Sarah sobbed loudly, shouting, "Why would Dad do this to us? He left for 11 years and now he comes back to take everything." Nathan slammed his fist on the table, his eyes blazing. "I'll sue. This will isn't legal. Dad couldn't leave half the estate to someone like him." I sat there, stunned, not because of the money. I had never thought about my father's estate, but because of his words. He had read my letters, he had kept them, he had regretted, but my mother's words, Nathan's, Sarah's, cut into me like knives. I wanted to stand up, to run away, but then I thought of Luke, of how he always reminded me I was stronger than I thought. I took a deep breath, stood and looked directly into my mother's eyes. "I didn't come here to take anything from anyone," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "I came to say goodbye to Dad, but if this is his wish, I'll honor it. I'll protect what he left me, not for the money, but because it's his way of saying sorry to me." My mother stared at me, her eyes a mix of anger and pain. "You're not my son," she said, her voice cold as ice. "You were never part of this family." Her words were a final cut, but I didn't collapse. I had heard similar words 11 years ago, and I had survived. I would survive again. Mr. Thompson raised his hand, his voice firm. "The will is completely legal, drafted when Mr. Robert was of sound mind. Any disputes will be settled in court, but I advise you to respect his wishes." Nathan stood, shoving his chair back, and stormed out, Sarah running after him. My mother gave me one last look, then turned away without another word. I left the office, my feet heavy as lead. I didn't feel victorious, only a deep sadness. My father had left me half his estate, but he couldn't give me back the years I'd lost, couldn't erase my mother's cold gaze or Nathan and Sarah's hostility. I stood on the sidewalk, watching golden leaves fall, and wondered if I really wanted to return to Willow Creek ever again. That night, I stayed at a small motel on the outskirts of town. I called Luke and told him everything. "You did the right thing by standing up," Luke said, his voice warm over the phone. "Your father saw you, Julian. Even if it was late, he saw you." I cried for the first time since learning of my father's death. Not out of grief, but because for just a moment I felt I was no longer invisible. The next morning, I drove back to the old house in Willow Creek. The air in the town felt heavy, as if the entire community was abuzz about my father's surprising will. I overheard whispers when I stopped to buy coffee at a roadside diner. He came back to take his father's money. The Pierce family must be furious. I tried to ignore them, but each word pierced my chest like a needle. I wasn't here for money. I came to close the past, to find a sliver of peace among the wreckage of my family. The house still stood there, the white picket fence now more peeling than before, my mother's garden overrun with weeds. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding, unsure if my mother would let me in or send me away like she did 11 years ago. The door opened, and there she stood, still in black, her eyes weary but still sharp. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to go to Dad's study. Mr. Thompson said I need to pick up some documents related to the will." She stared at me, as if weighing whether to let me cross the threshold. Finally, she turned, leaving the door open, and said, "Be quick and leave." I stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in the house where I grew up. The smell of old wood and the lingering scent of lilies from the funeral hung in the air, a reminder of loss. I walked through the living room, once filled with Nathan and Sarah's laughter, where my father used to read the newspaper every evening and my mother would knit by the window. Now everything was silent, cold, as if the house itself were mourning. My father's study was at the end of the hallway, exactly as I remembered. A large wooden desk, bookshelves filled with thick law books, and a family photo from when I was 15 hanging on the wall. I looked at the photo, seeing my forced smile next to my father, mother, Nathan, and Sarah. It was the last time we were all photographed together. I wondered if my father ever looked at this picture and thought of me. I sat in his chair, inhaling the scent of old leather and ink. Mr. Thompson had sent me a list of documents to retrieve, a copy of the will, real estate contracts, and some financial papers. I opened the desk drawer, searching, but my eyes stopped on a small, weathered wooden box tucked in the corner. My heart raced. Something told me I had to open it. Inside the box were dozens of letters, postcards, and small gifts I had sent over the past 11 years. Every letter I wrote to my mother, every birthday postcard for my father, every small bottle of wine with a Father's Day note, all were here, neatly arranged as if they were treasures. My hands trembled as I picked up a letter, my handwriting from my first year in Chicago describing my new job, Luke, and my hope that one day my family would understand me. I opened another postcard, sent for my father's 60th birthday, with the words, "I still think of you every day, Julian." I couldn't believe it. My father had kept everything, even though he never replied. At the bottom of the box, I found a yellow envelope with no recipient's name. Inside was a handwritten letter, my father's shaky script. I opened it and the words danced before my eyes. "Julian, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I didn't have the courage to say sorry while I was alive. I was wrong, Julian. I let fear and prejudice blind me to the love I had for you. I read every letter you sent, and each time I wanted to call you to tell you I was proud of you, but I couldn't. I can only hope that by leaving you a part of me, I can make up for some of my mistakes. I love you, Julian. I always have." Tears fell, dripping onto the paper, smudging the ink. I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling as if my heart were breaking and healing at once. My father had seen me. Though late, though through words never sent, he had seen me. I sat there in his study, crying like a child, crying for the 11 years of loss, for the unanswered letters, and for a father who loved me in a way he never spoke aloud. My mother's footsteps pulled me back to reality. She stood in the doorway, her gaze still cold but tinged with something different, as if she were holding something back. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked, her voice slightly unsteady. I held up my father's letter but said nothing. She stepped closer, glanced at it, then turned away. "Take it and leave," she said, but she didn't sound as harsh as before. I wanted to say something, to ask if she had read my letters, if she had ever thought of me, but I didn't have the courage. I nodded, gathered the documents and the wooden box, and left the house. As I drove away from Willow Creek, the afternoon sun bathed the hills, making them glow like in my childhood memories. I felt lighter but also heavy. My father had left me not just an inheritance, but the recognition I had craved for 11 years. Yet my mother, Nathan, and Sarah remained walls I couldn't break through. I wondered if they would ever open their hearts, or if I would always be a stranger in my own family. When the plane took me back to Chicago, I held the wooden box in my lap as if it were the final piece of my father. Luke met me at the airport, and when I told him about the letter, he hugged me tightly. "You're not invisible anymore, Julian," he said. "Your father saw you, and you've seen yourself too." I nodded, tears falling again, but this time they carried not pain but a glimmer of hope. Chicago welcomed me back with the familiar cold winds from Lake Michigan, but this time the city felt like a true home. Our apartment in Lakeview, adorned with paintings on the walls and shelves filled with novels my mother once read to me, now carried a warmth I hadn't noticed before. My father's wooden box sat on the dining table, a reminder that I had been seen, even just once, by the man who had been the center of my world. I spent the week that followed reflecting on what my father had left me. The 50% of his estate wasn't just money. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, a chance to do something meaningful. I didn't want to keep it for myself. I had a stable career, a good life with Luke. I wanted to use it to create something bigger, something that could help others like me, those who felt invisible in their own families. I decided to establish a scholarship fund in my father's name, the Robert Pierce Scholarship for LGBTQ+ law students. The idea came to me during a sleepless night as I sat by the window watching snow fall outside. I wanted my father to be remembered not just as a strict lawyer or a father who made mistakes, but as someone who tried to make amends even if late. I contacted a nonprofit organization in Chicago, and they helped me set up the fund. Each year it would support a student, helping them pursue their dreams without living in the shadow of prejudice. Creating the fund felt like closing a painful chapter of my life, but one piece remained unresolved: my mother. I knew she was still angry, still hurt, and perhaps still unable to accept me. But my father's letter, his words, made me think I had to try again. I called her, not expecting her to answer, but when her voice came through on the other end, I could hardly believe my ears. "Julian," she said, her voice weary but not as cold as before. I took a deep breath and told her about the scholarship fund, about how I wanted to honor my father this way. I said I didn't want to hold on to resentment, that I still loved her despite the scars the past 11 years had left. She was silent for a long time, and I thought she might hang up. But then she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand you, Julian. I'm not sure I ever will, but I read Robert's letter. I know he regretted." She didn't apologize or say anything more, but it was the first time I felt a small crack in the wall between us. That conversation didn't heal everything, but it gave me hope that one day my mother might see me not as a disgrace, but as her son. I didn't call again right away, but a few weeks later I sent her a postcard with the words, "I'm still here if you want to talk." Julian, I didn't expect a reply, but I felt lighter, as if I had let go of part of the burden I'd carried for 11 years. Life moved on. I returned to work, to advertising campaigns and creative meetings, but now with a newfound sense of purpose. I no longer drew to escape, but to tell stories, to inspire. And then, One spring evening, as cherry blossoms bloomed along the Chicago River, Luke did something I never expected. We were walking along the river as we often did. Luke held my hand, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Julian, you've given me a home, a life, and your heart. Now I want to ask you something." He knelt down, right there on the cobblestone path, and pulled out a simple silver ring. "Julian Pierce, will you marry me?" I stood frozen, tears welling up before I could process them. I nodded, pulled him to his feet, and we embraced, laughing and crying under the fiery sunset. "Yes, Luke. Yes." Our wedding took place on a summer afternoon in a small garden on the outskirts of Chicago. Friends, colleagues, and a few distant relatives from Luke's family in Ohio were there. I didn't invite my mother, Nathan, or Sarah, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew they weren't ready. But I left an empty chair with a framed photo of my father on it. In the frame was a picture of him teaching me to ride a bike when I was young, both of us smiling brightly. I looked at the photo, and in that moment I felt no anger or resentment, only a gentle sadness like a breeze passing through. As Luke and I exchanged vows, I felt like I had found a new family, not the one I was born into, but the one I chose. Luke, with his smile as bright as summer, was my true home. And as we cut the wedding cake, I looked around at the joyful faces and knew I had weathered the storm. I sit in our small apartment, the light from a candle on the dining table flickering, casting shadows on the paintings I made for Luke. Tonight is a quiet night, just me, a journal, and thoughts flowing like the river outside. I write, not to send to anyone, but to reach those like me. Those who have felt they belong nowhere, who thought they had to hide their true selves. If you're reading these words, I want you to know you're not alone. There will be days when it feels like the whole world has turned its back on you, like your family doesn't see you, like you're unworthy of love. But I've been there, in the shadows, in the fear, in the long nights, wondering if I was a mistake. And I made it through. Not because I'm stronger than you, but because I learned that love for yourself, for the family you choose, can heal the deepest wounds. I think of my father, of the letter he left, of how he tried to make amends even when time had run out. I think of my mother, of our last phone call, of the small crack in the wall between us. I think of Luke, who held my hand through every storm, and of the scholarship fund in my father's name, helping young students live true to themselves. Life isn't perfect, but it's worth living because I've learned to accept, not just others, but myself. I set the pen down and look out the window. Luke walks in, placing a mug of hot tea beside me and kissing my forehead lightly. "Finished writing, my author?" he asks, his smile lighting up the room. I nod, pulling him to sit beside me. We gaze at the candle together, its soft light dancing like a promise of better days. My story doesn't end here, but the cycle of grief, loss, and healing has come to a close. I'm no longer the frightened boy in Willow Creek, nor the man standing in the rain 11 years ago. I am Julian Pierce, a husband, a creator, and above all, myself. And the light from that small candle in our apartment is proof that I've found a chance to be reborn.